I was a sophomore in college and had just moved to a new campus in a rural area. I've always been the kind of person who gets bored with the same routine of classes, library, and college parties. So when I found out there was a popular hiking trail nearby, I thought it'd be a good idea to explore it. It wasn't anything too wild, just some trails students used to unwind, take pictures, or have picnics. I grabbed my backpack, filled up a water bottle, and decided to go alone, something I'd never do today. It was early afternoon, and the day was perfect. Clear skies, a fresh breeze, the kind of day that makes you feel like everything is going to go right. At first, everything seemed fine. I followed the main trail, marked with yellow arrows, until I came to a smaller path that seemed more interesting. It looked like just a shortcut, I thought, and decided to take it. But the farther I walked, the more the arrows and signs disappeared. The ground was covered in leaves and branches, and before I realized it, I had no idea where I was. I tried to backtrack, but it felt like the forest around me had changed, like the place was pushing me further away. That's when I heard footsteps. I can't explain the mix of relief and fear I felt at the same time. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, and suddenly a man stepped out from behind the trees, carrying a large backpack and wearing a worn-out hat. He smiled, but the way he looked at me was unsettling. He introduced himself as Jake and said he was an experienced hiker who loved camping in the area. His voice was friendly, but something about his tone seemed rehearsed, like every word had been calculated. "You're lost, aren't you?" he asked, laughing in a way that made me uneasy. Still, my situation didn't leave me much of a choice. I explained that I had wandered off the main trail, and he nodded, pointing in the direction he came from. "I know these trails like the back of my hand. I can guide you back." Despite the knot in my stomach, I accepted his help. What else could I do? Stay there alone? At first, he seemed to know what he was doing. He talked about the surroundings, pointed out trees, animal tracks, even mentioned camping in the area for years. But as time went on, something started to feel off. The path we were taking seemed more overgrown, with dense vegetation and no signs of any real trail. I asked if we were going the right way, and he responded with a wide smile. "Trust me, you'll recognize the trail soon enough." That's when I started noticing strange details. He knew the names of every stream, every curve, even mentioned a rock with carvings on it that we passed. But how could he know all that so precisely? I started to feel like he was leading me deeper into the forest, not out of it. By now, the sun was lower, and the light filtering through the trees was casting long, distorted shadows. I tried to hide my uneasiness, but it was hard. With every step, the air felt heavier, like something unseen was closing in on us. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing my hesitation. "Just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile while my mind raced to figure out what was happening. That's when he suggested a break, pointing to a small clearing ahead. When we got there, I noticed something strange, marks on the ground, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. "It's fine, really. Just a rest spot," he said, but his voice now sounded different, less casual, almost eager. As he rummaged through his backpack, probably looking for water or a snack, my eyes were drawn to something hidden among the nearby trees. A metallic glint caught the fading sunlight, and when I got closer, I realized it was a knife embedded in a tree trunk with scratch marks all around it, as if it had been used repeatedly there. My heart pounded. That definitely didn't seem like something you'd find in a rest spot. Before I could think of how to mask my panic, he suddenly stood up, holding something in his hands, a canteen and a coiled rope. "You're way too tense. Relax," he said, with a smile that now felt like a mask. That's when I knew. I had to get out of there. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I started thinking fast, planning my next move. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, pointing to a line of bushes nearby. He hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged. "Don't go too far, okay? It's easy to get lost." I nodded with a forced smile, though my hands were shaking as I walked away. I moved slowly until I was out of his sight, Then I ran. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I needed to put as much distance as possible between us. Branches scratched my face and arms, and the crunching of leaves under my feet felt deafening in the quiet forest. Behind me, I started hearing hurried footsteps and a muffled voice calling my name. After what felt like forever, I tripped over something that almost sent me sprawling. A thick rope stretched between two trees like a trap. I looked around and saw what appeared to be a small campsite hidden among the trees. My stomach turned as I took in the scene. There was a burnt-out fire pit surrounded by scattered objects, a doll with its eyes torn out, dirty clothes, and a notebook filled with grotesque drawings of human figures caught in traps. I couldn't look for long. By now, the footsteps behind me were getting closer. That's when it hit me. Whoever this guy was, he'd been leading me straight to this place the entire time. And worse, he wasn't alone. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground as I tried to process what I was seeing. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. A sound came from the trees to my right, and I turned sharply to see him standing there, about 30 feet away. "You shouldn't have wandered off like that," he said, and his tone was completely different now. There was no trace of the friendly, helpful guy he had pretended to be. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and no words came out. He took a slow step toward me, almost as if he was testing how far he could push me before I'd react. Suddenly, another noise came from behind him, something moving quickly through the trees. He stopped and tilted his head slightly, as if he had heard it too. It was the distraction I needed. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran in the opposite direction, ignoring the branches tearing at my skin and the uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. His shouts echoed behind me, but now there were other voices mixed in. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if someone else was there, but it only made me run faster. My lungs burned, and I could taste blood in my mouth, but I kept going until I saw a faint light ahead. It looked like the main trail. When I finally reached the light, I realized it was an old lamppost, one of those used to mark rest areas along the main trail. The relief was so overwhelming I nearly collapsed, but I knew I couldn't stop yet. I glanced behind me, seeing nothing but darkness, no sign of him or the voices. Still, I kept moving, this time with a bit more direction. The lamppost meant I was close to an exit, or at least a recognizable path. The problem was, night had fallen, and the forest felt even more sinister under the dim light. Every shadow seemed alive, and every sound made me jump, convinced he was still following me. After what felt like hours, I heard voices again, but this time they were different. Normal. Distant shouting. Laughter. I followed the sound until I stumbled out onto a makeshift parking area. A small group of people was there near their cars, setting up what looked like a campfire. I must have looked like a mess because, as soon as they saw me, they rushed over. Before I could explain, I started crying uncontrollably. When I finally managed to tell them what had happened, one of the men grabbed a flashlight and insisted on going back into the trail to look for the guy. But he didn't find anyone. No camper, no hidden campsite, nothing. It was like the place had disappeared completely. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go near that forest again. Just thinking about what happened makes my skin crawl. I reported everything to the police, but without concrete evidence, they brushed it off as a misunderstanding, or my imagination running wild. Trails can be disorienting, and people sometimes misinterpret things when they're scared, the officer said, as if trying to convince me it wasn't real. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. This wasn't my imagination. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. Who was that man? Was he really alone? Or were the voices I heard from accomplices? What were those objects at the campsite for? I've never heard of anyone else experiencing anything similar on that trail, but sometimes I dream about the place. I always wake up with the same feeling of being watched, like it's not really over. I don't know if he's still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting person, but if you ever decide to explore a place you're not familiar with, never go alone. I've been living alone in a small house in the countryside for a few years now. I moved out here to escape the chaos of the city. Too much noise, too much stress. Life here was simple: planting a small garden, taking walks along the dirt roads, and enjoying the quiet. I felt safe here, surrounded by a few friendly neighbors and endless open fields. That all changed one winter night. It was a Friday, and the wind was howling through the trees, making the branches scratch against my windows. I was curled up on the couch under a blanket, sipping a hot cup of tea, watching my favorite series. The last thing I expected was for that peaceful night to turn into something that would haunt me for months. It was close to midnight when I heard it. A knock, knock, knock at the front door. My whole body froze. Who would be knocking at this hour in the middle of nowhere? I stayed still for a moment, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing except the wind. My curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, made me peek through the side window, careful not to open the curtain too much. Standing on my porch was a man. At first glance, he looked ordinary, dark jacket, hands in his pockets, but there was something off about him. He just stood there, completely still, staring at the door. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down on the road. Can I use your phone?" My heart was racing. Sure, I had a phone, but there was no way I was letting a stranger into my house. I answered through the door, trying to sound firm, though my voice wavered a bit. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Maybe you can try one of my neighbors." There was a pause. He didn't knock again or press me further right away, but he didn't leave either. After a few seconds, he spoke again, his tone still unnervingly polite. "I understand, ma'am. It's just pretty dark out here. Maybe you could just hand me the phone through the door?" That didn't sit right with me. Something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed, like he was trying to lower my guard. I stood firm, or at least I tried. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Good luck." For some reason, he didn't leave. I kept watching through the curtain, and he just stayed there on the porch, head lowered now, like he was thinking about his next move. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would echo through the room. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. After all, he hadn't done anything aggressive, yet. But his presence wasn't normal. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, then took 2 steps back and disappeared into the darkness. Even then, I couldn't relax. I stayed up all night with all the lights off, straining to hear any sound that might indicate he had come back. Every creak of the wood or gust of wind felt amplified. When the morning finally came, I was relieved, but what I found outside made my stomach churn. When I opened the door that morning, the cold air hit me, but that wasn't what made me shiver. Right away, I noticed my car's tires had been slashed. This wasn't an accident. You could see the deep, jagged cuts, like someone had used a knife. But the most unsettling thing was the footprints in the dirt around the car. They were fresh, leading straight to the backyard. My chest tightened. Whoever that man was, he hadn't just lingered, he had tried to get closer. I took a few hesitant steps to follow the prints, but stopped, the thought of what I might find making my legs feel weak. I went back inside and locked everything again. Later, one of my neighbors, Jim, stopped by. He's an older guy, one of those people who seem to know everything happening in the area. When I told him what had happened, he frowned and told me something that made my skin crawl. Over the past few months, he'd seen strange people wandering around the area, usually at night. They didn't seem lost. They looked like they were searching for something, or someone. "They're not from around here," Jim said gravely. I didn't know what to think. The idea that the man could be connected to something bigger made me feel sick. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every noise felt suspicious, and I kept glancing out the windows every few minutes, watching for any sign of movement. When night fell, I thought about staying at Jim's house, but the fear of walking in the dark kept me rooted in place. I locked every door and window, checking them twice. Even then, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Occasionally, I peeked through the curtains, but everything looked normal, just darkness and the sound of the wind. Then around 11 p.m., I heard something. It was faint, like someone trying to open the kitchen door. My heart started pounding again. I grabbed my phone and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I called the local police and explained the situation as best as I could, trying not to sound paranoid. They said they'd send a patrol car, but it could take a while due to the distance. While I waited, I felt a mix of fear and helplessness. I tried listening for more sounds, but everything had gone silent. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, trying to calm myself. But when the motion light in the backyard suddenly turned on, I knew I wasn't alone. The fear was immediate, and every second felt like an eternity as I waited. The light stayed on for a few seconds and then went out. It felt like someone or something was testing me, trying to see how I'd react. I stayed frozen in the bedroom, clutching my phone tightly. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek out the window, just a little. Out there, at the edge of the yard, was a silhouette. It stood still, almost motionless, with its back to the porch light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clearly a person. I watched for what felt like forever until the figure took a single step back and vanished into the shadows. A short time later, I heard the patrol car arriving. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night, illuminating the yard briefly. The officers searched the property but found no one. They told me it was probably some drifter or a prankster, but promised to keep an eye on the area. That didn't comfort me. What unsettled me the most was the man's calm demeanor the night before, how he just stood there like he knew it would unnerve me. I stayed up the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. The next morning, I finally mustered the courage to walk around the yard in the daylight. The footprints were still there, but what disturbed me most was finding them beneath my windows. Whoever it was hadn't just been lingering in the yard, they'd been looking inside. I took pictures of the footprints and sent them to the police, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere. Later that day, I visited Jim again to share what I'd found. He listened carefully, his face growing more serious with every detail. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Years ago, a woman who lived alone in a house similar to mine had a similar encounter. A man had shown up at her door late at night, claiming his car had broken down. She let him in, and according to Jim, no one ever saw her again. The police never proved anything, but locals believed she had been taken, or worse. I didn't know if he told me this to warn me or to scare me, but the connection between the stories gave me chills. After hearing that, I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed up what I could and moved to a friend's place for a few nights. Eventually, I came back with 2 officers to do a full sweep of the property, but as always, there was no sign of anyone. Still, the footprints and slashed tires were proof enough that someone had been there. I installed cameras and extra locks, but it didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the end, I decided to leave for good. It wasn't an easy decision. That house represented years of hard work and my dream of a peaceful life in the countryside. But I knew I'd never feel safe there again. On moving day, as I loaded the last boxes into the truck, I looked back at the house one final time. The porch where the man had stood, the yard where the footprints had appeared, the windows he might have been peering through, all of it felt tainted. Even now, months later, I still think about what might have happened if I had opened that door. And to be honest, it's a thought that still keeps me up at night. When I moved into the new apartment, the first thing I noticed was the strange silence in the building. It was a nice place on the outside, with well-kept flowers and fresh paint, but it felt empty. The hallways echoed with the sound of my boots as I carried boxes, and I could barely hear TVs or voices from any neighbors. After a few weeks, I started noticing something even stranger. The apartment next to mine, number 204, never had any signs of life. The blinds were always closed, even on the brightest days. I never heard footsteps, laughter, or any noise coming from there. It was like it was abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. I saw someone, a man, leave once early in the morning with his hood covering half his face. He didn't look at me, didn't greet me, just passed by like I wasn't even there. Then, on a particular night, everything changed. It was a regular Tuesday, and I was slouched on the couch, watching something I didn't even care about when I heard muffled sounds coming from 204. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, because I had never heard anything from that apartment before. But the sound kept going, like faint whining, maybe a suffocated voice. I felt uneasy but ignored it, thinking it wasn't my business. But then it got louder, almost like a muffled scream, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, threw on a jacket over my pajamas, and went out into the hallway. When I reached 204's door, the noise had stopped for a second. Hesitant, I knocked. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" I asked, trying not to sound intrusive. That's when the door, which I thought was locked, creaked open just a little. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. The smell hit me first, something metallic and acidic, like someone had left chemicals around. The light was dim, coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the walls were covered with symbols I didn't recognize. They were painted in black and red, with erratic strokes, almost like someone had done it in a hurry or with anger. There were also photographs plastered on the wall. A lot of them. Some seemed normal at first. Landscapes, people walking down the street, things like that. But when I looked closer, I realized that all of them had something off about them. Strange shadows, unfocused eyes, like the people in the photos were looking straight at the camera in a wrong way. I should have walked away right then, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. My heart was pounding, and everything inside me was screaming to turn back and forget what I had just seen. But before I could do anything, I felt a draft, and the door slammed shut with such force that I jumped back. I tried to open it again, but it was locked. I stood there, shaking my hand on the doorknob, unsure if I should call someone or just go back to my apartment. The strangest part was that the noise stopped. There wasn't a sound from inside, just a heavy silence hanging in the air. As much as I wanted to pretend nothing had happened, I couldn't convince myself to leave it behind. I took a step back and kept staring at the door like it was going to give me some kind of answer. My heart was still racing, and my mind kept replaying everything I had just seen. I pulled out my phone to take a picture of the door, maybe to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. But when I raised it, I noticed something even stranger. The light that had been leaking through the door cracks was gone. It was like the entire apartment had been swallowed by darkness. I tried to listen for anything. Footsteps, voices, the sound of a TV, but there was nothing. Only silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that felt like it was swallowing me up. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't relax. I sat on the couch, staring at the wall that separated my apartment from 204, as if I could feel something moving on the other side, and then I heard it again. First, a faint sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Then, a creaking sound, like someone was slowly opening a door or a drawer. But I knew no one had come or gone from that apartment since the door slammed in my face. I grabbed my phone, thinking about calling the building's office or even the police, but I stopped before dialing. What would I even say? That I heard noises and saw weird symbols. It didn't feel like enough. And deep down, I knew there was something far more sinister going on. After a while, the sound stopped again, and the silence returned. I stayed sitting there, motionless, with the feeling that something was watching me. It was suffocating paranoia. I looked at the clock. It was past midnight, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I decided to distract myself with something, so I grabbed my laptop to watch a video. Just as I put on my headphones, I heard something much closer. This time, it was like a whisper coming directly from the wall next to me. It was so quiet that at first, I thought it was all in my head. But it wasn't. It was real. I leaned closer to the wall to hear better, and I swear the words sounded like something incomprehensible. It wasn't English or any language I knew. It was rhythmic murmuring, like some kind of chant or prayer. I froze, my heart in my throat. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but when I turned off the light to calm myself down, I saw something that made me freeze. Beneath the door, where the hallway crack should have been, a weak light started to flicker, like a candle. But it was impossible because 214 should have been completely dark. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I grabbed the key to my apartment and rushed out to the hallway, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself to just go downstairs and talk to the janitor. But the moment I closed my door, I heard something from 204 that made my heart stop for a second. A click. The sound of the doorknob turning, as if someone was opening the door. I stood frozen in place, staring at the door to 204. I knew I shouldn't go any closer, but my feet moved on their own. When I got closer, I saw that the door was slightly open again, just like before. But this time, something was different. The hallway light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness inside. I tried to convince myself to turn around and go back to my apartment. But a sick curiosity pulled me forward. I reached out for the door, pushing it open just a few more inches, and what I saw made me recoil instantly. The floor inside was covered in a dark liquid, almost like paint, but with a strange, thick texture. In the center of the room, a figure, or rather, the shadow of a figure, was standing with its back to me, motionless, its head tilted in an unnatural way. I didn't have the courage to say anything, and my breath became so heavy I almost gave myself away. But before I could pull back completely, the shadow seemed to move. It didn't turn like a normal person would. It slid sideways without making a sound until I had the distinct feeling that it was looking at me, even though it had no eyes. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and ran back to my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it so hard that my hands were shaking. I stood there, my head pressed against the door, listening to see if anything had followed me, but the hallway was completely silent. For a few seconds, I thought I was safe. But then I heard a sound that almost made me scream. 3 loud knocks on my door, followed by the softest, most disturbing sound I've ever heard, like something long and sharp was scratching at the wood. The knocks kept coming, rhythmic and calculated, while the scratching sound seemed to slice through the wood. I backed away, phone in hand, but my fingers were trembling so much that I could barely unlock the screen. I called the building's office, but no one picked up. When the knocking suddenly stopped, the silence was even worse. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do, until something caught my attention. Beneath the door, where there should only have been the dark crack of the hallway, a light started flickering again, like before. What was even stranger was that it seemed to move, as if something was crawling on the other side of the door. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. They weren't normal. They were slow, dragging, and they stopped right in front of my door. Once again, the knocking started, but this time it was louder, almost frantic, as if someone was trying to get in. I couldn't bring myself to get any closer, so I stayed there, staring at the door, waiting for it to stop. Then, out of nowhere, it all stopped. The knocking, the scratching, the light, all of it. I waited for a few minutes before looking through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I tried to sleep, but whatever was in that apartment still haunts me. I've never heard anything from 204 again, but every time I pass the hallway, I feel that same presence, like it's waiting for me. I never thought a rideshare ride would put me in a life-or-death situation. It was around 2 a.m., and I was finishing up my last trip for the night. A request popped up on my phone. Destination industrial area. The location didn't seem great, but it was close to home, and I just wanted to wrap things up. When I arrived, I noticed the street was completely deserted. There was no one around, and the streetlights barely lit the way. The passenger was sitting in the back seat, looking pretty calm, but something about his expression made me uneasy. He was staring out the window and didn't say anything until we got close to a dark alley. Then, he simply asked me to stop there. I thought it was strange because the street was completely empty, and there was no sign that anyone was expecting him. "Right here. Just stop," he said firmly, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. I asked if he was sure, if he didn't want me to take him somewhere safer, but he refused. "Just leave me here. Go away after." The tone of his voice didn't leave room for more questions. Before I could do anything, he was already opening the door. As I saw him walk toward the dark alley, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right, but I just wanted to leave quickly. That's when everything took an unexpected turn. I didn't have time to think. Suddenly, another car appeared out of nowhere and blocked my path, stopping right in front of me. The headlights were so bright I could barely see what was going on. I was still trying to figure out what was happening when all of a sudden, the passenger I had just dropped off in the alley came running back, but now with a different expression. He looked more aggressive, his eyes locked on me, and his hands were extended as if he wanted to do something. Before I could react, he tried to open my door. I immediately locked the locks, but he didn't give up, pushing hard against the window. Panic took over me in an instant. I put the car in reverse without thinking and sped off, hearing the sound of something hitting the side of my car. It all happened so fast, and before I could fully comprehend what was going on, the blocking car started to pull away. I couldn't see the other car anymore, but the feeling that I was still being watched didn't go away. Trembling, I parked in a more lit area, and with sweaty palms, I called the police. When I told them what had happened, their response was something that still chills me to this day. After I finished telling the police everything, they asked me to wait since they were sending a unit to the scene. I was too shaken to stay there. Everything felt like a movie scene, but the reality hit me so hard I could barely process it. The police told me they would check the area's security cameras and that I should wait until they had more information. While I waited, I started thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't reacted so quickly. The guy seemed to have far more sinister intentions than just a normal ride. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The police told me there had been a series of robberies in the area over the past few weeks, and all of them followed the same pattern. Rideshare drivers being dropped off in isolated spots, followed by cars blocking the driver's exit and attempts to invade the vehicle. The pattern was identical to what I had just experienced. My mind was spinning. This wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just another isolated event. I started thinking about how many people had already been victims of that same situation and how I had been lucky enough to get out unharmed. But the most disturbing part was that the police said they had never caught anyone involved in these crimes. The feeling of insecurity stayed with me all through the night. I couldn't sleep, and every sound I heard outside made my body tense. The worst part was knowing that the criminal was probably still out there, moving through the same streets, waiting for another victim. I tried to stay calm, but that alley, the car blocking my path, the passenger's expression, all of it kept playing over and over in my head. I didn't know who to trust anymore. The passengers weren't just customers anymore. They could be a threat disguised as one. All I did was take someone to the wrong place, and in the end, I almost lost my life because of it. When the police finally arrived at my car, they told me I was out of immediate danger, but they wanted me to stay alert and report any suspicious behavior. Over time, I found out that the place where the ride ended had been the scene of other similar crimes. One of the more recent robberies happened in the same alley where the man had asked me to stop, and the victims had been forced out of their cars after being surrounded by another vehicle. None of these victims, just like me, knew what was going on until it was too late. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't been able to escape. Even now, months later, that feeling of fear still haunts me. The fact that I never saw that man again or even heard about him gives me the chills. Who was he really? What did he want? And more importantly, how many other drivers have gone through something similar without even realizing it? I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but the fear, that's something I carry with me to this day. The strangest part of all this is that despite everything that happened, I never heard of another case like mine. The police ended their investigation, and I never knew the outcome of any of the other incidents in that area. It seems like, somehow, that series of robberies just stopped, as if nothing ever happened. The other drivers who went through the same thing, maybe they never knew about the pattern or the severity of what was happening, or maybe they just didn't talk about it. I don't know if I was an exception or if there was something bigger behind all of this, but the feeling that what happened to me had no explanation still disturbs me. I keep thinking about that look on the passenger's face and that car blocking my path. Even today, I wonder, was that night just a coincidence? Or was I really being targeted by something bigger? Suddenly, the idea that it might have been a well-planned scam, something much broader than I realize, starts to feel more and more real. But in the end, what scares me the most is the fact that, at the end of it all, the feeling of being watched never really went away. It's like, somehow, I'm still being hunted. And the worst part is that to this day, I've never gotten any answers. That night went unexplained, and the uncertainty still lingers with me. The only thing I can say for sure is that the sense of danger was real, and whatever happened that night, as inexplicable as it is, will never leave my mind.